Welcome to F4 Podcasts. I'm in Geneva today, and I am with the person who heads the Geneva Center for Security Policy, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, a distinguished Swiss diplomat. He's also served in the Swiss military, and he is a man who is known for his wisdom, insights, and generosity, not only amongst his Swiss colleagues, but others who know him from around the world. So, welcome, Thomas.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you this afternoon, Atul.
Pleasure is ours. Since we have a very limited few minutes with you on a very busy day, we'll get straight into questions I have for you. Today, we are going to have a Swiss perspective on world affairs today. And the very first question I have with you is about a summit on the Russia Ukraine war. The Swiss convened it. You know a lot about it. Tell us about the context of this effort and what has it led to?
Well, let me start on a positive note. This summit on the Birkenstock in central Switzerland gathered an impressive number of heads of states, around 90, that all called for an end of the war based on the UN Charter, implying based on the respect for international law. They agreed to do follow-up work in three distinct areas on food security, on safety of civilian nuclear infrastructures, and in humanitarian affairs, implying mainly exchanges of prisoners of war and access of relief. On a more critical note, the summit did not manage to reach out to a more inclusive set of countries. In particular, it did not manage to mobilize many members of the so-called Global South.
Hmm.
That was clearly disappointing. And the summit did not reach an agreement on the next step towards a inclusive process that would bring the Russian Federation on board of a peace process. The summit was perceived to be very successful by the Swiss government, by the Swiss people, and I would argue by largely by Western countries. It was seen more skeptically by the expert community and by representatives of the Global South. The Russian Federation was eventually, well, at the outset, clearly said they would not attend. And consequently, Switzerland did not invite the Russian Federation, which led to harsh Russian criticism.
I see. So let's get to deeper issue. I have been to Germany and Austria. We have partners in both countries, and German friends who are in business in particular have been extremely nervous about the continuing war. As you know, there was the Mario Draghi report recently, which nearly 400 pages, which is about the EU losing competitive place to the US, or losing in competitiveness to the US and China. And of course, there are many reasons, perhaps in Chinese demand, US protectionism. But a key factor that the report stated was Russian energy, or rather the end of cheap Russian energy. And my friends in business, particularly manufacturing in Germany, are nervous about this conflict because it means a lot of them are having to fire workers, a lot of them are having to worry about bankruptcy, a lot of them are losing market share. So there is a nuanced view in Europe about the war, some of which is exploited by the far right. I want to know the Swiss view on the war. How does Switzerland A view the war, and B, how does it view the impact of the conflict on Europe?
Well, clearly, the war has tremendous repercussions on Europe in many ways. Economically, clearly, energy prices have skyrocketed. And this has, in particular, of course, impacted on countries and industries that were particularly dependent on Russian gas.
like German manufacturing.
Absolutely, but also, Austria, Hungary, countries, that until today have a high dependency on Russian gas and oil. Switzerland was in a slightly more fortunate position, less dependent on Russian energy. In that sense, it also impacted less on the Swiss economy, but still, I mean, it's also politically, it's the second major crisis within basically 4 years after COVID. Now
Yes.
came the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that absorbed a lot of resources, a lot of attention, and diverted it, from other important areas. And you can see that also when it comes, to social spending, spending on health, education, etc. There is clearly a crowding out
Mm,
effect by massive increases of defense budgets,
mm,
and a crowding out effect that is clearly also visible in Switzerland. And then obviously we should also speak about the European security order, and
mm,
here the war, I would argue, has put an end to an order that, at least to an extent, was marked by cooperative security
mm,
based on the Helsinki process. I think the last traces of cooperative security have disappeared with the Russian aggression, and it's highly likely that this remains so for the foreseeable futures.
mm,
So uh, we will face a European security order that is very conventional, that will be to a largest extent based on deterrence, and it is unclear, for how long this will last. This also implies, that you have a security order against Russia, and the big question, will we manage one day again, to turn it towards an order that would include Russia.
mm.
Clearly, this would also imply massive policy changes in Moscow, a readiness to again play along the rules, respect international law. And there is, for the time being, not really a clear perspective to kind of, overcome this deep dividing line that we now see running through Europe, reminding us very much of the Cold War. And so there are many experts that refer to a new
Yeah,
Cold War. I think it's tricky because the political situation is clearly different. It's not bipolar, it's multipolar today. It's more complicated, but it's true. As somebody that has experienced a significant part of the Cold War personally, many of the phenomena that we currently witness remind me of the Cold War.
I see. So we are back to the division of Europe into two camps. One, of course, is much of Europe, and one is the Russian Federation with allies like Belarus and maybe a few other actors, arguably, who have their own geopolitical axis to grind.
Correct. But, Russia is, after all, the largest country. So,
In the world, indeed. Mm.
I mean, simply look at a map and then you understand what Russia means for European security. And I think if one thing is clear, you will never achieve comprehensive European security without Russia.
Good. So we've talked about European security, and EU High Commissioner Joseph Borrell said that Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. It was a controversial comment. Germany has closed its borders to avoid the jungle taking over the garden. Will the rest of Europe follow suit? Will Switzerland follow suit?
Well, let me start with the image used by Josep Borrell, who I respect, by the way, very much, but I think it was clear and a very unfortunate image. I would then move on by saying that Germany did not really close its borders, but it did reintroduce border controls,
Yes, fair enough.
which is
That's enough. I
it's
stand corrected. It's like it's a different thing.
it's quite a
Yeah,
difference,
yeah.
and you know, still I would say inter-European travel is comparatively speaking remains relatively easy, yeah, if I compare with other world regions. But still,
No,
I mean,
absolutely. I went from Germany to Austria, and I've just come from France to Switzerland. And getting a visa is difficult, of course. Yeah, I have an Indian passport, and that can cause pains. But once you have the visa, inter-European travel, it's striking how easy it is compared to much of the world, actually.
absolutely. So once you have entered the Schengen space, it becomes easy. Well, yes, now it has become a slightly more challenging when entering Germany because indeed these border controls, we're just not used to them anymore.
Mm,
I would admit. Now, this said, in many European countries, you will see that the populist right is gaining ground, and politically, this leads to anti-migration agendas gaining ground, rising up on the political agenda. Partly, this is also outright xenophobia that we see. This comes along
mhm.
with an increasing pressure on refugees, on migrants in general. In practically all European countries, including here in Switzerland, you hear politicians calling for the rapid return of rejected asylum seekers. So migration is again very much a mobilizing political theme that is fully exploited by the populist right.
Let me have a follow-up question because I hear not just from the populist right, but I hear from, say, CDU leaders in Germany, which is a center-right party, Angela Merkel's party, that whilst they are for immigration, there have been problems with assimilation of immigrations. And this CDU leader would not want to be quoted, so I will not take his name. But what he said was that, look, we failed in many ways when we got Gastarbeiters from Turkey, when we got other migrants. They, of course, worked. They developed their own ghettos. And today, in France, in the Netherlands, and in Germany, Recep Tayyip Erdogan gets 65, 67, 68% of the vote. I don't have the exact figures country by country, but it's certainly north of 65 in these three countries. And he said he does not get this much vote in Istanbul. So our Turks, he said, are far more religious and far more ghettoized and far more Islamist than the Turks living in Istanbul. So we have a problem within our countries, and we have to somehow tackle it honestly without ceding ground to the populist right, and that's a difficult needle to thread. So the populist right is responding to an issue which politicians are acknowledging off the record in Europe.
That is correct. There is an integration issue, and clearly these open door policies that were adopted after the migration crisis of 2016, they're today assessed quite critically. So I think there is a general sense that the doors were too open back then, and national systems were not capable to absorb in particular, you know, the less skilled migrants, refugees. So there is an issue, absolutely. But I would still argue, you know, it is the challenges are partly at least overstated and clearly exploited by the populist right, and the policy responses often not very helpful in,
mm,
for instance, promoting better integration.
mhm.
And clearly, the return of rejected asylum seekers is not going to solve, the migration challenge in Europe. On the other hand, we have everywhere aging populations, and
Mm.
we have in certain skill areas, our economies, are desperately seeking for skilled workers. And so, in a way, I think what this would call for is for a much more proactive migration policy, as opposed to a totally defensive, reactive migration policy that we currently see in most European countries.
We've touched upon crises, and Europe is experiencing deep political, economic, and social crises. And there's a lot of commentary in the reports of the European Commission itself refer to them. The Draghi report refers to the crises. Robert Fico is back in power in Slovakia. Viktor Orban continues to rule Hungary. Or Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, parties on the rise in Germany. And parliamentary elections led to a hung parliament in France. We all know Rassemblement National did very well in the European elections and came first in the first round of the elections. Question to you is, how is Switzerland faring? And how does Switzerland view this development in Europe?
I mean, it's true, and we refer to it. There is clearly a rise of populist movements all over Europe, and I think that is a reason of concern. Yes, the good news is that in Germany and in France, at least for the time being, we managed to keep these right-wing populists and nationalists out of government. But it's true, these populist movements, they keep gaining strength, and I think we should also look carefully why this is so. I would argue this is, at least to an extent, also a response to socio-economic developments over the last 5, 8 years. That to economic growth that was not inclusive.
Mm,
So basically, people see more Porsches, more BMWs, more Mercedes, more Teslas
mm,
in the street, but you have also more people that barely manage to pay their monthly rent,
mm,
their health insurance, that constantly are going up. So there is a sense that something is wrong with the type of growth, with the type of globalization that we have seen, and I think this again is exploited by these
yeah.
populist movements.
So
Now,
the cost of living crisis, all the way from the US to Western Europe, is really helping populist leaders.
absolutely. I mean, you can see this in cities like Geneva here.
Yeah, yeah,
You can see it in
indeed.
Zurich. You can see it in the canton of Zug, for instance.
Mm,
Normal people, they have to move out of this canton, at least out of the city of Zug, because rents are not affordable anymore, because property prices have been driven up so dramatically recently. Now, I mean, politically in Switzerland, there is, of course,
mm,
a similar type of populism here as well. I think it has very much been taken up by one party,
mhm,
the Swiss People's Party. One has to say that this party, offers a relatively broad tent, and in that sense, perhaps also manages to contain the extreme fringes of the party.
mm,
But still, I mean, if you look at migration policies, they clearly have a xenophobic
mm.
dimension, economic recipes, etc. So you see a lot of similarities with other right-wing populist movements elsewhere in Europe. Perhaps the Swiss political system allows a bit better, to contain these extremist forces.
Because of the principle of subsidiarity, I suppose.
I think that's an important principle, absolutely. And these parties, if even if they have 30 and at times even more percent of
Of the
the
vote,
votes
yeah.
in a given commune, for instance, well, at the end of the day, they will have to deliver, and this automatically leads then to more reasonable approaches and policies,
Mm.
if at the end of the day you have to deliver services to your citizens.
Our listeners should know that the Swiss have democracy right down to the local levels. The Swiss system is not centralized like France or India or the UK. And so the principle of subsidiarity simply means okay, the national parliament decides something, but then you have the regional legislatures, and then you have local elections or officers, and all of them have real power, and all of them are responsible for delivering services. And this contains the demagogues, because you can't promise simple solutions to complex problems and then blame someone else. Now, speaking of Swiss success, let's talk about Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway signing a free trade agreement with India. Your colleague Ralph Heckner was ambassador of India. He's now ambassador to the US. He's credited with achieving what the EU, the UK, and the US have failed to achieve. So, what is the secret of Swiss success?
Well, I just met Ralph Heckner in Washington, so would definitely give due credit to skilled negotiators, good diplomats that contributed to this outcome, and certainly on both sides, because you always need two to tango if you want to achieve a negotiated outcome. I would argue EFTA countries are not part of the big trade blocs, so they have more of an incentive to strike agreements with major emerging markets
I see.
like the Indian one, if you want, under a higher pressure to kind of
Yeah.
succeed.
Especially
With
with the weakening of the World Trade Organization. So, you
absolutely,
do need these deals much more than before.
they're extremely useful.
Mm.
Now, in the Swiss case, I mean, India is one of the five most important trading partners
Mhm.
of Switzerland. So again, it's quite obvious,
Yeah.
that you would invest quite some political capital to that end, and I think that's what I also saw. There was a political commitment to reach a conclusion of these negotiations. There was no domestic resistance,
Yeah.
contrary, for instance, to economic relations with China that have come under more pressure. This is not the case with India. India is perceived very positively here in Switzerland as an important, dynamic, rising economic actor.
So, you mentioned India as the fifth largest trading partner. And this brings me on to my next question. Is Switzerland looking east for economic growth? If so, what are the top export markets?
Look, Switzerland has always had a very strongly export-oriented economy. So by
Yes.
default,
Yeah.
a country like Switzerland would look out for growth markets.
Hmm.
Now you have many of the most dynamic growth markets in Asia,
Hmm.
and if you look at the figures, yeah, you see China, India among the top five for Switzerland.
The US, I'm sure, would be right up there.
The
Sizable
US
market.
is high up.
Yeah.
That's correct.
The
Uh,
EU and Japan are
well, EU is by far the most important
exactly.
trading partner. But okay, this also has a lot to do with geography. So,
Indeed.
among the most important trading partners of Switzerland, you find Germany, France, and Italy, which, makes a lot of sense
Indeed.
given
The history and geography.
our geography. But then, when you see where figures have gone massively up. Indeed, you see, well, also in the Middle East,
Mm.
figures are going up,
Exactly. Yeah.
UAE, Saudi Arabia. So I think Switzerland has no choice than to look for growth markets, and they happen to be in Asia.
Well, exactly. So now that we've touched upon Asia, how does Switzerland view Chinese foreign policy, especially its turn towards a more aggressive stance? And how does China's current slowdown affect Switzerland?
Well, let me say at the outset that China remains a very important market for our economy. This is true for both trade and investments. But this said, the enthusiasm that marked Swiss-Chinese relations for years has clearly cooled down. And I think this is to a certain extent attributable to the economic slowdown, but also, to constraints that private actors face
Mm.
in doing business in
In
China.
China, yeah.
There is this criticism of not really being offered a level playing field.
No, no, I'll give you stories I heard in Munich from senior business
Yeah,
executives who spoke of rampant intellectual theft.
yeah,
It was a senior person in one of the car companies who said, we'd have a partner who'd just steal our technology and we could do
yeah.
nothing about it. And they also said that it was a double-edged sword dealing with China because the slowdown in China, the economic slowdown in China, has really hurt German industry and German car makers in particular, because they were relying on Chinese demand for luxury German cars. So
Absolutely.
Germany is suffering a lot because of the Chinese economic slowdown. And Germany has been unable to somehow wean itself off reliance on China despite persistent intellectual property theft in China. So it's complicated. I want to know, is the Swiss experience better? Because you seem to be savvier than the Germans when it comes to foreign policy.
Well, I think it's a matter of being less dependent on certain sectors.
Mm,
So there is no Swiss dependence on the car sector, and
mhm,
that clearly helps. Eh?
mhm,
So there is more of a diversity, and in that sense, I think the slowdown is being felt.
mhm,
These constraints,
mm.
these operational constraints that we refer to, are being felt. But all in all, there still seems to be a perception, that you can make good money in China. Eh?
Mm,
But when I refer to a cooling down of the atmosphere in Swiss-Chinese relations, this has indeed also, and here we come back to your question, at least partly also to do with this much more assertive foreign policy under President Xi Jinping, and it's human rights violations, but also yeah, very assertive policies in the South China Sea. I think this has contributed to this cooling down. And I would still argue, comparatively speaking, Swiss-Chinese relations are still better than other European countries' relations, and definitely much better than these very strained and polarized US-Chinese relations. But it's not as it was 10 years ago, clearly. I should perhaps add, very specifically, as perceived from my center's point of view, the Chinese see us as a neutral country and as a potential facilitator in their relation to other
mm,
Westerns, Americans, Europeans.
mhm,
So this implies for my centrist business a massively increasing Chinese interest
mm,
and much more relations with the Chinese in terms of them participating in our capacity building, executive education offerings, but also when it comes to offering dialogue platforms, we have now developed a number of informal dialogue tracks that involve Chinese and bring them together with other Europeans and Americans, and that is very much appreciated.
Well, you spoke about Switzerland's ability to mediate and act as an interlocutor. And that brings me on to Africa. Sudanese General Abdel Fattah al Burhan has decided to sit out talks in Switzerland to resolve his country's ongoing civil war. How does Switzerland see the current conflict in Sudan? Because you've just done a conference in Ukraine where the Russian Federation didn't come, and now, of course, you're doing another thing on Sudan, and here again, Burhan is not coming. So, a bit of a challenge even for the Swiss.
Well, let me first point out that Switzerland has indeed been a traditional facilitator and mediator when it comes to conflict in Sudan. We were closely associated. We were, as a matter of fact, facilitating the Nuba Mountain ceasefire. That
Mm,
was a good 20 years ago. We contributed to the UN negotiations on the comprehensive peace agreement for Sudan. So there has been, a history of Swiss engagement in Sudan. Now, you refer to the recent talks in Geneva. They were facilitated mainly by the United States. They're leading
mhm.
this peace process, but Switzerland was a co-host and co-facilitator of these negotiations that took place in mid-August here. Unfortunately, as you rightly put out, one of the sides decided not to attend the peace negotiations. So we only had representatives of the rapid support forces here, but not representatives of the Sudanese armed forces. And this, of course, made it impossible to reach a breakthrough when it comes to the ceasefire that this US-led process aims at. It did produce progress when it comes to unblocking access of humanitarian aid. There was this Adre border crossing that would be open thanks to the negotiation. But again, a ceasefire remains out of reach, which I think is an indication that parties haven't reached this mutually hurting stalemate that
Yeah.
Bill Sartman referred to when talking about the right moment for conflict resolution. So they still believe in being able to gain military advantages on the battlefield. And as long as this is the case, we won't see progress in negotiations, unfortunately, and to the detriment of millions of refugees.
All right. So we've talked about a lot of countries in many parts of the world. My final question, inevitably, is about the US. As you know, I live in Washington, D.C., when I'm not traveling like a maniac. And I've just come back after not a very extent, but a rather interesting and prolonged, decent stay in Japan. And I will not talk about the Japanese view of the US, that we will at another occasion, at another time. My question is, what is your view of American democracy today? And how is Switzerland navigating the polarized politics of the global superpower, or the only world superpower?
Well, look, there is clearly quite some concern here in Switzerland about this highly divided US society. And I think we Swiss are quite anxious to see now the upcoming presidential elections. The big question is, will the loser then also accept the result or not? If not, what destabilizing effects this will have generally the functionality of the US system, but also, in terms of long-term negative effects on the American democracy.
And the rules based global order.
Absolutely. If you want to advocate
Yeah.
on the international scene, the rules-based global order, obviously, you should be a model back home, and I think the US is less and less perceived as this model of democracy.
And
Uh,
also, there's a question of consistency. The US came up with the idea of the League of Nations and then famously walked out of it. And then the US has walked out of two climate accords, Paris and Kyoto. And from an Asian standpoint, the Trans Pacific Partnership trade deal that took over a decade to negotiate. Suddenly, one day, Donald Trump wins and it's out of the window. And even when Joe Biden wins, the TPP, the Trans Pacific Partnership, is not back. So there's this real sense of anxiety among smaller countries about, does the US stand for anything and can we trust its word? And the way the US has weakened the World Trade Organization, the WTO, is causing massive concern. I hear that from lots of people, including your colleagues. So there is anxiety in the air.
No, absolutely. And this is, of course, a very fundamental concern. I mean, this is one of the most basic principles, pacta sunt servanda. If you don't live up to treaties that you have signed, well, you become unpredictable. You lose credibility as an actor. Now, how to navigate
Hmm.
this. Well, I think there is no other option than being flexible, being open-minded, being ready to cooperate with whoever, will then be the winning administration. And I can illustrate this point. I just come back from Washington,
Yes, you mentioned.
and for the first time, I did not only talk to current administration, National Security Council, State
Mm,
Department, Pentagon, to our regular think tank partners, but I made it an objective to talk to a number of Republican
mm,
representatives, that would potentially make up a new administration.
mm,
I saw there are broad range of opinions
mm,
voiced. It makes a big difference if you talk, to a Reaganite,
mm.
or if you talk to
A
what
Trumpite.
what is called, well, we talked to the MAGA people,
Mhm. Make America great again.
exactly, and well, they call themselves, depending on their foreign and security policy outlook,
Mm,
prioritizers, that argue that the United States should exclusively focus on one theater,
mm,
the one that is most important for national interests. And and then there is a school of thought that is entitled the restrainers.
mm,
They're generally of the opinion that the United States should do a lot less in
mm,
terms of engagements abroad. So they're also termed less elegantly isolationists.
mm,
So it's relatively a broad spectrum
mm,
of opinions, but again, I made it a point to hear them out and also to establish a contact,
mm.
because you want to be ready if there is a second Trump administration after the November elections.
Excellent. So you respond to a more unpredictable US by being flexible and by keeping communication lines open with everybody.
I think that's a fair summary.
Brilliant. Well, Thomas Greminger, thank you very much. Always a pleasure. And those of you listening to this podcast, make sure you follow us. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter on our website, fairobserver.com. We also have an app which you can download, and we'll have many such guests, many such voices from around the world. Until then, it's bye for now. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Atul.